The U.S. tariffs have left China reeling. China's market has plunged deep into the red, and Hong Kong's stock market has suffered its worst drop in nearly 3 decades. On the first trading day after the weekend, the Shanghai Composite Index plummeted by over 7%, wiping out roughly $500 billion in a single day. Meanwhile, the Hang Seng Index, the benchmark for leading stocks in Hong Kong's market, dropped 13%, erasing several $100 billion more. But President Donald Trump isn't stopping there. On top of the 10% tariff imposed on Chinese goods in February, an additional 10% in March, and a newly announced 34% last week, Trump has now threatened to raise tariffs by another 50%. This effectively doubles the cost of importing Chinese goods into the U.S. What does this mean for global trade? And how is China responding to America's tariff war? Special thanks to Ricoh Group, a multi-sector corporation with 4 prominent subsidiaries in the building materials industry. Experts assert that the 104% tariff effectively acts as a trade embargo, obliterating all transactions between the world's 2 largest economies. President Trump aims to punish China, especially for daring to retaliate in this trade war where the U.S. has continuously escalated tensions. On social media, Trump declared that China had implemented retaliatory tariffs of 34%. If China doesn't revoke this 34% increase, Trump announced, the U.S. will impose an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods starting April 19th. That means by tomorrow, we're essentially in a high-stakes staring contest. Whoever blinks first loses. However, China has devised a robust countermeasure, striking not only through tariffs, but directly targeting the global supply chain. So far, China has been trying to exercise restraint. A few months ago, when President Trump first imposed a comprehensive 10% tariff on Chinese goods, Beijing retaliated, but in a measured way, targeting specific sectors, primarily U.S. energy products such as coal and liquefied natural gas. When the U.S. increased tariffs by another 10%, Beijing responded again with a moderate reaction. This time, the focus shifted to American agriculture, targeting items like chicken, beef, and soybeans. In turn, President Trump escalated the situation by implementing a 34% tariff. As a result, Beijing announced an equivalent 34% retaliatory tariff on U.S. goods. Trump defended his approach, stating, "I think the way we calculate tariffs, we're applying less than they are. So how can anyone be upset about that?" However, Beijing was indeed upset. The 34% counter tariff marked a stronger, more assertive response from China, signaling an intensification of the trade dispute. For Beijing, Washington has escalated to an entirely different level. President Trump has effectively trampled on the rules-based order and replaced it with reciprocal tariffs negotiated line by line, country by country. Ideally, these tariffs would disappear, but if they don't, China is determined not to appear weak. However, Beijing understands that retaliating with tariffs alone won't have the desired impact, much like Trump's earlier attacks on China. Let's look at the numbers. In 2024, the U.S. sold over $140 billion worth of goods to China, but imported nearly $440 billion from China. This imbalance means that a 34% tariff on Chinese goods has a far greater impact than the same rate applied to U.S. exports. Therefore, China's response isn't confined to tariffs. Instead, it has announced a series of countermeasures, such as restricting exports of vanadium and rare earth metals. China controls approximately 90% of the known global supply of these valuable resources, materials crucial for powering electric motors or enabling fighter jets to soar through the skies. They are elements on the periodic table, some of which you might never pay attention to because of their obscure and difficult-to-pronounce names, like dysprosium or terbium. Honestly, I'm not even sure how to pronounce them myself. However, if you're building an electric vehicle and need to keep your neodymium magnets from losing their strength under extreme temperatures, you'll need dysprosium for heat resistance. If U.S. Marines are conducting a nighttime raid and soldiers need night vision goggles, you'll rely on terbium to convert infrared light into something visible to the human eye. Recently, China added 7 new rare earth elements to its list of controlled materials. Now, U.S. companies wanting to purchase these items must obtain a special license. Don't think of this as mere paperwork. It's essentially a disguised export ban. Clearly, China realizes it cannot match the U.S. tit for tat in the tariff game. So they're playing different cards to impose additional costs on the U.S. This move adds to the list of rare earth elements that China has already restricted or outright banned from being exported to the U.S. Experts say that China has meticulously curated this list, targeting precisely what the U.S. needs. For instance, Some American aerospace manufacturers use Chinese-origin materials to produce avionics, but now they're facing significant bottlenecks. While the U.S. and its allies have stockpiles of these materials, the constraints are becoming increasingly evident. However, those reserves will soon be depleted, and China is waiting at the crossroads, ready to apply pressure that might force the U.S. to back down or come to the negotiating table. If you're curious about how China's actions are shaping its trajectory, pay attention to their official statements. Beijing has accused U.S. tariffs of severely infringing upon the legitimate rights and interests of all nations, violating WTO rules, undermining the rules-based multilateral trading system, and disrupting the global economic order. Beijing warns that the U.S. will face a boomerang effect due to its economic bullying and risk-shifting behavior. What does this rhetoric signify? First, Beijing wants to project itself as a tough negotiator. They seek bilateral talks where both sides have leverage, rather than one-sided demands from the U.S. At the same time, China aims to garner global support by consistently painting the U.S. as a bully since the trade war began. This narrative has gained traction. Across the globe, protests against U.S. tariffs have erupted, even within the U.S. itself. American goods are being boycotted. In Canada, America's next-door neighbor, Americano coffee, has been renamed Canadiano.
First, the signs were subtle. A Danish grocery...
Initially, the signs were subtle. A Danish grocery store put up signs urging customers to buy local products. A French fashion boutique quietly stopped stocking Levi's jeans. Canadian supermarkets removed American bourbon from their shelves and rebranded Americano coffee. Then hashtags began to surface. Boycott USA, boycott American goods, and goodbye Made in USA. Before you could blink, there was a full-scale boycott targeting Tesla, Coca-Cola, General Mills, McDonald's, and even Netflix. Things seem to be looking grim for America. So, what exactly does Trump want? Trump claims that China has flooded the world with cheap, unfairly subsidized goods. This practice, he argues, undermines the manufacturing capabilities and economic security of nations that cannot compete with Chinese products. The U.S. is facing a trade deficit of nearly $300 billion with China. Trump views this as evidence that China is cheating the U.S.
Trade deficits are no longer...
The trade deficit has evolved from being merely an economic issue into a near-national crisis, threatening America's security and way of life. However, experts argue that trade deficits or surpluses are not inherently bad or good. The U.S. has experienced trade deficits since the end of World War II, simply because it is wealthier than any other nation. As a result, it consumes more goods than others. Here's a simple comparison to make this clear. As consumers, we have significant trade deficits with markets and supermarkets because we buy from them. At the same time, as workers, we have a surplus with the companies we work for because they pay us. Companies pay us, yet we don't buy anything from them. Unless, of course, you're South Korean, in which case you probably owe everything to Samsung. Either way, the central point remains: bilateral trade imbalances are not inherently bad. Trying to figure out what Trump truly wants from this trade war is incredibly challenging because his goals are sometimes contradictory. For example, on one hand, he declares that he loves tariffs. He claims the revenue generated from tariffs will be paid by American companies. But then he also says that the purpose of tariffs is to do the opposite: to convince enough American companies not to pay those tariffs by bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. There are even times when he seems to view tariffs simply as a tool to outmaneuver opponents and secure concessions unrelated to trade. Take, for instance, his efforts to force the Chinese company behind TikTok to sell its U.S. operations to Americans. Trump's statements often feel like navigating a maze of contradictions. Yet, we've managed to uncover a way to decipher his true intentions behind these aggressive tariff measures. What do you think about Trump's relentless tariff strategy? Let's discuss in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, KyHuynh Insights. Until next time, goodbye and see you soon.